everybody, and welcome to the Psychology of Men show. I am Dr. Kip Pietrantonio, and with me, as always,
Dr. Ryan McDermott.
All right, so today we are going to be talking about what we call precarious masculinity, and we're going to be talking about a few different domains of this, how it shows up in physical strength, sexual prowess, toughness, money and success, stoicism, and logic and expertise. But first, I think our own Dr. Ryan McDermott should give us a little introduction of what is precarious masculinity. What does that mean? The word precarious, I don't even know if I fully know what that word means. So take us through what that means.
Right. So Joseph Vandello and Jennifer Bosson are the people we most attribute to this particular theory. But basically what it says is that if I threaten a guy's masculinity, he's going to do all kinds of stuff to win it back, because masculinity is kind of something you earn through, for lack of a better word, point system. Like, so, the idea of masculine points or masculinity points, and they're really easy to lose and really hard to get. And they've tested this through a lot of different experiments where they threatened people's masculinity, and then they gave them choices of things to do afterwards. And the ones that were threatened were more likely to do some pretty stupid stuff. Yeah.
So Ryan, what would be a way that they threaten, just so we can get like a picture of the experiment, what would it be? What would be something they would do to threaten somebody's masculinity?
Right. So like the classic study they've done is they've given someone a masculine task, or even you could say maybe a gender neutral task, where let's say you have to braid a piece of rope. But then the masculine threat task is you have to braid hair on a mannequin. And then afterwards, so they're both doing the same dexterity with their hands, but afterwards the mannequin condition is more likely to then want to do some things like punch a steel plate to show how hard they can hit, do some kind of sports activity. There are a bunch of different variations of this study.
Mm-hmm. So that's really, okay, so that's really interesting. So it's, now are the guys aware that that they feel this way, or is this kind of an unconscious mechanism, would you say?
Yeah, this is a deception study. They're debriefed afterwards. The people, of course, who say that they picked up on it are excluded from the analyses and things like that. We actually did one in my research team where we gave people fake personality feedback and said, like, compared to most guys, you're like in the 90th percentile. So that's like a masculinity boost condition versus compared to most guys, you're not very manly, essentially. And then we looked at how that impacted their desire to own firearms. So, I mean, it's you can do it in lots of different ways of threatening this masculinity.
That's really interesting. So, okay, so let's dive into some of the ways that this masculinity, kind of our goal for the show today is to talk about these different ways that masculinity tends to be threatened and kind of how we earn those man points or lose man points in these different areas. So the first one is physical strength, Ryan. And I thought with each of these, we would talk about kind of our own personal experience with this a little bit before we kind of dive into like how it gets threatened. So what would you say is in terms of like physical strength for you, your experience of that masculinity?
Well, so I'm about 6'4" and I weigh 180 pounds. And I grew up really, really fast. So at one point I was 6'4" and I weighed only like 150, 145 pounds.
Right.
And I was picked on because of how skinny I was. So I, like a lot of guys, I think probably who watch the show can resonate with this. I've tried to put on muscle mass. Sometimes in some pretty stupid ways. I would go on these kind of like weird diets to get more calories in my life. And my favorite one, this was in high school, I decided that I would just, instead of drinking milk with my meal, I would drink eggnog with every meal.
Wow.
Yeah, well, one day in the middle of a 90-degree heat, I had a bunch of eggnog and I went out skateboarding, and that didn't end up too pretty. So I've done my share of stupid things. One thing I've never resorted to is steroids, though, and there is a lot of research actually out there. It shows that this drive for muscularity, which is the scientific way of saying I don't want to be so thin, put on more lean muscle mass, that is associated with steroid use in certain conditions. But it's also associated with good exercise habits. And if anything, I think that actually my desire to gain weight finally got me to the gym, and I started working out, and I started to feel better about myself.
It's really interesting because this is, for me, it's like something it's so obviously not something I earned necessarily, but then like once I already had it, I ran with it. So it's like naturally I was stronger than most of my classmates,
Mhm.
which of course, like a complete idiot, I just took complete pride in. Like somehow I earned this, but because I was always like a bigger kid in like terms of being overweight, I kind of felt like there was like probably that was fueled by this justification thing.
Mm.
Like, oh, everyone's always been faster than me and like been able to wear smaller clothes than me, but this is finally like my thing. Like I finally get to win. And then it's funny because I think this happens with a lot of guys. It's like with any like sport or something like that, you have a propensity for something and then you just like double down on it as much as possible. So like because I had this propensity to be stronger than most people kind of naturally, I just like went full on and I was in the gym constantly and I was like burning out on everything. Like I
Wow.
remember like bench pressing as much as I possibly could,
Wow.
like over and over and over again, and like really getting caught up in like the numbers and focusing on the numbers. And to me it was like so obvious now in retrospect that that was like a masculinity. That was a way I could win masculinity.
Huh. Yeah, that's, it's interesting. You mentioned the whole thing about the natural talent. Um, so my skateboarding, sort of mentioned that I do that, or used to do that anyway. I did that for about 8 years, but I never had a natural talent at it. There were these guys who were much better at it than I was. But I was also using skateboarding to a certain extent, looking back on it as a real way of trying to kind of prove my masculinity because I couldn't play sports, right?
Hmm.
So I didn't quite fit in there, so that resonates with me to some degree.
The skateboarding thing is really interesting to me because it's like on one hand, it's not very masculine, but then on the other hand, it totally is.
Oh yeah, I
And
still
that's really, it kind of dances the line.
I display it in my office right over there.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that? Because that to me is really interesting in itself, that there's like kind of this alternative, because it's clearly designed for like tall, skinny people to me.
Ha,
Like I always
actually,
thought that,
short.
like,
Actually, no, it's short, skinny people.
well, what about Tony Hawk? He's pretty much you, isn't he?
No, I think I'm taller than he is. I believe. Although maybe I'm not. I'm not sure about that. I never met him in person. Uh,
Yeah.
there were about two or three skateboarders who I knew who were really tall and lanky, and yeah, it gave you an advantage because when you're tall, you can like. I mean, I could ollie up onto a picnic table and certain, if I could do it. But sometimes I couldn't do it. But the pros, they just had a natural talent at it, and you every once in a while one would come through while we were skateboarding, and man, it just blew you away at like
Hmm.
how incredible they were. And those are the guys who are winning that masculinity game. And there are very few female skateboarders to this day. There's more, way more now than there was when I was doing it. I was doing that in the 90s.
Hmm.
It
So
was
I just looked up. Tony Hawk is 6'3".
Yep, I'm taller than him.
Yeah. You win.
I win the masculinity contest.
But it's kind of good. I mean, you know what? To me, the way that skateboarding represents masculinity is like the stunt, like the. It's kind of like the '50s culture of driving your car really fast, or like there's that episode
Yeah.
of like Happy Days where like the Fonz has to surf past a shark, right?
Yes.
So it's kind of this. It's kind of this like you're like risking a lot to show off to other people,
Right.
and then it's kind of that itself has turned into like skateboarding, which now has all this like coolness factor attached to it.
Right. But those guys aren't benching like a lot. Like so it's like a different kind of strength and risk. It's fascinating. I think every guy to a certain extent has to. This is actually the theory of precarious manhood. That every guy does it in a different way. There's many different masculinities, right? But
Hmm.
most guys play this game of to some degree. Somewhere in their life, they're trying to earn man points. What else we
So
got on the list?
how do you? Well, okay,
Okay.
okay. So next one is sexual prowess. Is that what you say? Prowess, right? Not
I don't
prowess.
know. I think that is prowess. No, does it have a W in it? That sounds kind of funny.
Yeah,
Prowess?
prowess. I'm not sure. So yeah, it's basically the idea that like the more you have sex with women, the more like masculine you are. So
Notches in the bedpost and that kind of thing.
Right. I think for me, this one has always been like as like a bigger guy, I have been like the classic like serial monogamous where it's
Ah,
like I get like one person to like me and then like make it last years, So I was never really the guy who like, was like dating people quickly or going from person to person to person. But I
right.
certainly knew a lot of guys who did that. Or the guy who would like talk to every girl at a party or something
Right.
like that.
Well, I married my first love, essentially. Got divorced 3 years later, and then went through what I call a skills acquisition phase. Um, and the online dating um, programs really helped with that process. And um, I actually looked at it as kind of like conquering some fears, like
Mhm.
conquering. I wanted to know that I could connect with women and not just that one woman. Um, and that was an important part for my self confidence, if you will. Um,
Yeah.
it feels good to win man points. Though I didn't look at it that way. That was more like an internal, uh, can I do this? I want to prove this to myself. Like, because I didn't
Right.
share it with anybody.
Because I think this one's actually really misunderstood, or
Mhm.
like I think the way somebody in like a gender studies classroom would talk about this one versus what happens in reality are two very different things. So I think when you think about the stereotype of sexual prowess, it's this idea of like this guy who's like like sleeps with these girls and then the next day with his buddies is like, "What up, dude? Like I got laid last night, man. Like yeah, this girl's like ass was so fat and blah blah." Like
Yeah,
and
right,
I don't think that thing exists.
right.
Or maybe it does, and it's like one out of like 800 guys or something like that. Like there's a guy, but I think most people would be like, "Oh, that's super douchey."
Yeah.
Here's how I think it actually shows up is like people are at a bar or a club or something, people are dancing, and like one guy can get girls to dance with him and another guy can't.
Mm,
Right. So there's kind of this like idea of like you have the courage to go up and talk to women. You have the courage to like and the confidence to interact with women and to successfully get them to like you back enough to like engage in the dating ritual.
right.
And if you're a guy who's like tries that, gets rejected, and then feels shut down,
Hmm.
that's where I feel like that masculinity like shows up. So you get man points if you can like get women to interact with you. And of
Right.
course, we're talking a very heterosexual narrative, so I want to acknowledge that.
Of course.
But it's like if you can get women to kind of engage in the dating rituals with you, then you tend to play this one out. And I think with at least younger guys, that's how that looks like.
Right.
If you get people, if you can get like women like snapping you or like going back and forth on like Instagram posts or like a lot of the guys, the big thing is like sliding into the DMs. You hear that a lot on
No, what's
Instagram.
that?
Meaning it means when you move from like talking on like the main story or talking on Instagram through comments to talking into the direct messenger. And the same
Ah,
thing is on the same thing is on Twitter. So you hear a lot of people say like, "Oh yeah, like we slid into the DMs."
fascinating.
Right.
I'm out of it, man. I don't hear that stuff at all. First of all, I've also been married then, since like 2011. So
Right.
2009. Uh-oh.
Hmm.
A while. So May
But I mean,
13th
what do you
is the
think?
anniversary, though. I do know that. Just want to point that
What
out.
what'd you say?
So May 13th is the anniversary, so I just want to point that out. I do know
All
that.
right. Well, congratulations coming
Just
up.
in case my wife watches this.
So, okay, but do you have any other thoughts on like the sexual prowess one?
You know, I think the part you said that really struck me was it's not that that guy doesn't really exist. I think that I have encountered that guy a couple times in my life, but I would even say that that doesn't really exist because uh, that's when you dig deeper in that guy that I'm thinking about. Like this is particularly people I've encountered in my clinical work. Um, there it's kind of fake. It's kind of like a mask trying to like connect with guys. Like it's oftentimes not even real. Like he didn't even like hook up with that many women and all these kind of things.
Right.
Um, and then also to add further credence to what you're saying, if you've seen the show How I Met Your Mother, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So what's his name? Yeah,
Yeah,
Barney.
Barney. Right.
Like
Yeah.
he is hilarious because he's so it's ludicrous. It's
Right.
ridiculous. But that is the guy That's the
Hmm.
guy. So it's, in other words, it's a stereotype that maybe there's some truth to it here and there, but I think most guys don't do that kind of thing. I think where it does come apart though is that guy who can't connect with women or feels like he can't connect with women has such a deep feeling of shame, I think, a lot of times, in part
Hmm.
because we don't glorify that. We don't glorify that he tried. You know, it's like the end result has to be a relationship or sex. Um,
Hmm.
it's like the people in American Pie, for instance, they all are trying to get, to get laid, and it's hilarious along the way, but ultimately, right? It's the end goal is still to get laid. It's not to conquer your fears or do something interpersonally challenging for yourself.
Right.
It's to kind of conquer a woman in that way. I think it is patriarchal and dogmatic, and that's why the word prowess I think is appropriate.
Mm. The other thing I think I noticed though too is like at least in the first two that we've talked about is that there's this same kind of it's like a self, what do you call it, like the motion machine that gets itself going. The same
Perpetual
thing kind
motion.
of, yeah, perpetual motion machine. Same thing kind of exists here. It's like if women respond to you well, you build confidence,
Oh yeah,
which then makes more women respond to you well, versus if women reject you, your confidence gets shut down really quick, which makes you more hesitant.
right.
Right, and that's the same thing with the strength, right? It's like if you have a natural strength, you like go into it, and if you
Yeah,
don't have that natural strength, you like have to find a new way, like you avoid that, right?
right. That
So
makes
that's
that's a
really
good point.
that's really interesting. Um, okay, so let's move on to the next one, which is toughness.
Yeah.
Talk Ford F-150 driving toughness. You can pull a yacht with your truck up a hill. There's like the most tough thing ever is all those truck commercials, and they all have it's like the Toyota Tundra.
Yeah.
Like Tundra, it's
Yeah.
cold, it's hard.
Yep.
Like
Yeah. Well, they have, they always have some kind of like image of something like a big heavy thing falling into the back of it.
mhm,
It's like that would really be bad for the shocks of any truck. It doesn't matter what
right.
truck it is. But what kind of car or truck do you drive, Kip?
I drive a Ford Escape.
Hey, all right. I drive a
Yeah.
Ford Edge.
Yeah. Ooh, Edge sounds masculine.
It is. It's
More than Escape.
yeah. Escape could be masculine too. Have you ever tried the Ford Avoid?
Yeah. The only way Escape is masculine if it's like if it's like Indiana Jones running from a rolling ball down a hill, like then Escape and like grabbing his hat right before the door closes.
Right.
That's the only way an Escape is masculine.
You bring up a good point here, though, that this idea of precarious manhood is really based on this idea of discrepancy strain. That
Hmm.
there's a strain that men have from their gender roles in the sense that it's really hard to meet the ideal in any kind of category of masculinity. And advertisers are damn good at figuring this out. Just
But
like
you
with,
know what? Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, but I'm also gonna say that like I think it's almost like it becomes like a joke almost.
yeah. I
Like
don't know if they're joking though.
but I'm saying like when you and I watch the Ford F-150 commercial, we know how over the top it is. And I think most people do too. It's not like you and I are the only one. It's kind of like the America. Yeah, like if you
Yeah.
make that like kind of if you do that voice around guys, everyone knows that you're kind of like paying homage to this fictitious
Uh,
like kind of like, oh yeah, like all I care about is
yeah.
fighting and drinking, kind of like guy. And I don't think that's really real. Where I actually think that toughness shows up, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong on this,
Uh-huh.
Ryan, is in not wanting to disappoint or be the weak link.
Mm,
So if me and you are loading wood, right, and I'm not getting tired and you are,
yeah.
you can't show that you're getting tired,
No, that's true.
right? So
I think that's a part of it. Maybe that's how it shows up in everyday real life kind of stuff. I can tell you where it shows up in the measures that we use to assess it
yeah,
is
yeah,
this
yeah.
idea that you have to be tough even if you're not big. Like um so classic example of this would be like you can hold your own in a fight. You know,
Hmm.
like I don't know if you've ever been in a fight, but that alone would be like an indication that you're tough, that you've gone through some shit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, do you feel like people get into fights that often now?
Oh man, I mean, I don't know about now, but I know growing up, I've seen a lot of fights.
Right. I
So
guess
much
maybe
so
that
that,
depends
yeah,
on where you're from too, right? So,
yeah.
but
I never. So I was in one fight. I got out relatively unharmed, and I didn't have to harm anybody. So I more or less, as my dad used to say, I faked left, I faked right. I had him right where I wanted him, 6 blocks behind me. But I did. I was able to kind of de-escalate the situation and everything, and the person was really drunk, and they missed me when they tried to punch me. But I've seen some horrendous fights, like with skateboards and things, and just you know, it was probably like a weekly thing that I saw one of those things. I think I had a little PTS from it, to be honest. Like I occasionally, when I see a guy walking in like on the street, I have a little bit of like, oh shit, myself. Doesn't matter what they look like. If it's another guy, especially at night, it just brings back those feelings for me. But do I think that made me tougher? No. In fact,
hmm
actually, I don't look at it that way at all. But the guys that I hung out with, I would
hmm
say they met this traditional view of toughness. Um,
right,
because half the time, actually no, like most of the time, they won those fights if you can consider winning at all. They had less
right.
damage.
But I think you could have just told me that story in a way that did win you man points if you wanted to.
Oh, and I do sometimes, for sure, depending on context. Are you kidding? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, if I'm around certain people that I know will like appreciate that, I will talk about how, I've been around people that have hit people with skateboards, and I sort of like, I think I fall back on that sort of thing when I'm feeling a little insecure, which is the whole idea of precarious manhood, is that we
Right.
latch onto that when we're feeling insecure in other places.
Yeah, because I think that kind of thing kind of shows up with me too, in that like, so I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is this like super rural kind of backwoods area, and the people who live there are known for being pretty tough,
Yeah.
right? So like, even though when I was there, I was just like, get me the hell out of here. Like, I just want to like go to a bigger city and like be able to go see bands that I like who actually play in towns that I can visit, you know.
Yeah.
But like, that'll totally happen where people like, even the town I'm from sounds insanely tough. The town I'm from is called Iron Mountain,
Oh wow. It's
which
like
is just
iron.
like the most masculine town of all time. But then like, so people will kind of like go with that and be like, whoa, he's like a big guy, he's got a beard, he's got a deep voice, and he's from Iron Mountain in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And then I have to remind them that I literally talk about feelings for a living. You know? So
Yeah, I
it's,
know.
yeah, it's like I can lean into that identity if I need to, which is, yeah, it's just kind of interesting. How about the idea of like mental toughness though, Ryan?
Hmm. Well, that's one we've definitely been looking at, right, in our research.
Mhm.
The idea of being emotionally strong, or being kind of resilient, if you will. Like, I mean, remember, all these things are things that may be more expected of men than they are of women, but women can do them too. I just want to make sure our readers, sorry, our viewers understand that.
Mhm.
I think mental toughness to me could come in many different forms, but when I think of classic resilience, I think it's the ability to bounce back after adversity. Like
Right.
to not let, like a trauma, for instance, rule your life. And there
Mhm.
definitely is that. Like I forget what the percentages are, but not everybody who's exposed to wartime trauma, serious wartime trauma, develops PTSD,
Right.
right? And what was that comment that Trump made that was so people found very offensive? He said that some people are killing themselves, not like you, you're tough, or something like that. When he was talking about
Yeah.
PTSD, you know what I'm talking about? Does that ring a
I
bell?
don't know that I don't know that comment, but it was kind of the same thing as like the McCain thing. That
Oh
it
yeah,
was
yeah,
like they're like like if you were that good of a soldier, you wouldn't have got caught,
right, right.
kind of thing. But how about, okay, you said this term emotionally tough.
Hmm.
And I'm curious if we can kind of unpack that term for a
Right.
second. Like, what does that mean to be emotionally tough?
Well, okay, I have my own personal definition, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention what all the people I interview have told me about. It's for them, it is the ability to stay strong for others when they need it. So like, let's say a death in the family, they aren't going to grieve because they're going to take care of the people around them first, and then they'll grieve privately at their own time if they can.
How about this one though? Like, okay, I think also part of it is like how you sort your problems cognitively. Right. So if for example, if I go like I'm saying this is like as a problematic behavior, but I think it's true. If somebody's like, "Oh, I just really feel like I have anxiety," and that like makes it really difficult, that person I think can lose man points.
Oh yeah,
Right.
absolutely, man. There's a connection between all kinds of mental health stigmas and masculinity stuff. Absolutely.
Right. So I just think that there's also this like how you attribute your problems, because the way is like I think that same person could also be like, I need to stop being a chicken shit and just do this,
Ah,
which has like it's saying the exact same thing, but it's saying it in like a masculine way, you
yeah,
know? And
yeah.
so it's also like the language you use, and then whether or not you attribute, like, because in the second example, I'm saying I'm blaming myself,
Right.
right? Like I need to stop being a chicken shit. To me is much more like this is on me and it's taking responsibility. And I think that's when I think about emotional toughness, a lot of it is like taking responsibility and like fix it myself. And like
Right.
through hard work and effort, I'm gonna get through it, as
Even if that,
opposed to like,
yeah,
yeah.
even if that means breaking the big man code and going to talk to somebody about it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but that's actually one way that we're trying to address, trying to get more men to go seek counseling, because as you know, they don't very often in colleges or anywhere, is trying to rebrand seeking help as a masculine thing. Like,
Right.
it takes bravery, it takes courage to ask for help. The Real Men, Real Depression campaign was all about that.
Yeah. One of the first things I say to a lot of people, a lot of guys, I say this to women too, but is, when we're talking about, we're doing informed consent, which is what you do at the beginning of therapy when you talk with somebody. One of the first things I say is, you're the CEO of your life, and I'm just a guy on the board of directors throwing out suggestions to you. And at the end of the day, you have to decide whether or not you want to take those suggestions, which ones you want to throw away, which ones you want to keep. But it's that idea that like I'm a consultant that you're like hiring to like check your brain,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Like that is like that makes somebody feel like a businessman or like a powerful person who's like, oh man, I'm like so powerful that I can like bring in a consultant
Ah.
on life, which I like a lot better than like, yeah, I'm here to help. I'm here to like pry open your masculine. If I can just crowbar around that masculinity and get to that gooey feelings underneath,
Right.
then if I can just get past the toxic masculinity, then I can get you to talk about the real feelings that, I feel like most people like hate that or like are like, why would I go to do that?
Yeah, it's funny. I really rarely ever talk about masculinity with my male clients by name anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like, in some ways, I give them a chance to save face. You know what I mean? Like, because I'm cognizant of the man points kind of thing. So I'm very solution focused and that kind of thing. But I'm digressing here. What's the next on the list?
Let's talk about the next one is money and success.
Money and
And
success.
I always feel like this one is summed up with a single sentence, which is, yeah, I run my own business. Like that statement to me, there's like nothing more masculine or like people want to be able to say that statement,
Right.
especially if they haven't found success or in other avenues. A lot
Right.
of times they'll want to say that statement as a way of like saving masculine, like saving their masculinity
Yeah.
or something.
Maybe it's the way I was raised with my dad being professor, my mom being professor, but for me, I get a lot of pride in telling people I'm a professor, like a lot of pride. And I think that I, kind of hang my masculinity hat on that a little bit as well too. So it's not about running my own business per se,
Right.
but it's about like being respected. And
Mm-hmm.
University of South Alabama is the premier institution of the Gulf Coast,
Mm-hmm.
especially in Alabama. And so it has a lot of respect. And I mean, I get discounts like everywhere I go. It's kind of fun, you know. Um, and I remember my dad, when I was in Warrensburg, Missouri, growing up at the University of Central Missouri there, people would say like, "Oh, hey, Dr. McDermott," you know, and like, you know, see him on the street and stuff. Same thing with my mom, in Kansas. And it's just like, I think that getting respect in general, I'm not sure it's about having money per se. I think it's about respect. If people respect you, you're kind of winning the masculine game a bit. But I mean, money I think is a common route people can go there. But like, so my brother-in-law does own his own business, and he's very wealthy. But he doesn't, you know, like, no one would know unless you ask, like, unless he somehow figured out a way to advertise it, and he doesn't do it. But here, because I'm getting the discount on those other things, people like know. There's a lot of chances for me to share it.
But
so
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think part of it though is also like and this is where masculinity meets social class. So there's also this piece of like if you're truly wealthy, you never talk about money.
Yeah, that's right.
Like money becomes hidden again, right? So part of it is also, and that's a very like white thing, I would say as well, to do that. Versus I think like the counterexample I would give is like hip hop culture, which nobody would argue is not masculine. Hip hop culture is insanely masculine, and there's literally a million music videos of people just throwing money.
Yeah, or like bathing in it, or like wearing a bunch of gold chains and
right. So the idea is that, like, you know, it goes back to the Tony Montana Scarface thing, is like, first you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the women, right?
You think it's like that? I mean, do you think that that's what's in people's minds?
I don't think it's necessarily that, but I think money is indicative of success and like options and being able to like buy flashy things. It's basically your way of getting your peacock feathers.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I know the research would support that. They've taken identical looking guys who sort of like are considered average or versus like attractive or whatever. But even the average guys get a big ass boost when they get you get to see their income, you know.
Right.
And you manipulate that to be higher and higher. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And the alternative is like, if a guy's unemployed, like, how do you lose man points here, right? Yeah. If a guy loses his job, or he's unemployed, or he doesn't make a lot of money, like the only way women tend to find somebody, like, let's say I worked at like a non-profit or something and I only, you know, I got paid very little amount of money, like I would have to wait for, like, in the traditional kind of relationship perspective, I would have to find the woman who like took sympathy upon that, like, oh, that's so sweet that he does that or something. But it's much harder to get a date if you're like a garbage man or something like that for a living.
I don't know. I mean, because I don't know any garbage or sanitation workers, I guess. But I think maybe I just want to say, I wonder if we're stereotyping here, because that sanitation worker might be able to win the masculine points in other ways, not necessarily about pity per se, but the toughness it takes to be a sanitation worker. I'm thinking like Mike Rowe or whatever his name is, you know, like the dirty jobs guy.
Right.
You know, there's something that's like the toughness piece. All these things are obviously correlated and kind of swirl around together.
But I think that guy loses points if his job, like if his dirty job doesn't produce an income that can buy things.
Yeah.
For that family.
Maybe you're right. I just don't want you to be right. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. Okay. That makes sense.
I mean, like, maybe you're right. My worldview, I don't want that to be right, because I feel like that's just kind of sad.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of the whole Trump coal miner thing. Right? It's that these coal miners are out of work and they're like hardworking people without anywhere to put their hard work. You know, and it's the reality, you know, and I think there is, like, if you are, like, for example, if you work at a grocery store, that's not as masculine as being like a construction worker. You know what I mean? Even though like a low-wage construction worker may pay similarly what a manager at a grocery store pays,
Mm.
but like one has much more of a masculine tone to it than the other.
Well, here's an interesting thing. In Mobile, there are a number of dock jobs, right? Like,
Mhm.
right there on the port. Um, and where my stereotyping came in is I was working, sorry, I was talking to somebody one time about what that was like to work there. And, I had going in and I thought he maybe made like $30,000 a year. He makes
Mhm.
$80,000 a year,
Hmm.
basically operating one of those cranes, those big cranes. And it's just
Right.
like, wow, you know. Uh, so maybe there's another piece in here. It's not necessarily about money. Maybe it's also about prestige. You know what
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in social class research, your social class is made out of three things: your income, your occupational prestige, which is
Uh-huh.
that second thing, and
Yeah.
then your education level.
Okay.
Right. So you take those three things and you end up with like a person's social class, kind of, if you're looking at a more objective definition.
That's interesting.
So yeah, so I would say like the combination of the money and then I would add another dimension, which is power.
Yeah.
Right. So that dock worker may have money, but he has very low prestige and he has very little power.
Right.
There's not a lot that job can do,
Right.
versus like, a teacher or something like that may have lower income but have a lot of power in their community and
Right.
have a lot of prestige because people tend to look up to, like, think teachers are a respected position, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. We
Right.
should do a study sometime about how masculinity fits with those three different components, because I think that really only it's been looked at in terms of like SCS, sort of like how much income you have.
Mm-hmm.
And the research has been really mixed. I have one study that I did that found that the higher SES you are, the more likely you are to be traditional. And the way we figured that out was that it costs money to be traditional, to have like the stay-at-home wife, for instance. That's like a high SES kind of thing. Um, but I've never done more work on it than that.
Yeah, I would say that's the same reason you tend to see Republican voters are very poor and very rich.
Mm,
It's
the
like,
dichotomy.
yeah, it kind of like comes back, like it's like people who are very rich adhere to those traditional masculine norms and everything
Yeah,
because like they can, but then people poor who are poor kind of do it but kind of out of survival.
yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean? Like you have to be tougher if your life is poor. So
Right.
you just like you need to like adhere to rules a little bit more for various reasons. So anyway, but okay, so let's move on from money and success. Yeah, actually, I want to say one more thing about that. Have you ever on HBO seen the show Ballers?
I have heard of it.
So again,
Yeah, this is one where they're the agents, right?
yep, and that show to me, and of course, it's The Rock, who's our favorite man on the in psychology show. We talk about him every episode. Um, he's like the star of that show. So he's like a former football player who now runs his own sports agency and uses his connections and ability to like make friends with other football players to
Yeah,
like make money for everybody.
yeah.
So it's kind of like this. I don't know. That show to me is I mean, it's literally called Ballers, which is, the idea of this money and success and masculinity. But that show to me is like the absolute epitome of this form of precarious masculinity.
Oh man. Yeah, we could go on for hours about this stuff.
Yeah.
Seriously. I mean, just in music alone, like
Hmm.
the term baller. Remember that song? I wish I was a baller. I wish I was a little bit taller. I wish I had a girl
Hmm.
collar. I forget his
Wow. There it is. There's three of them right there.
right. But like, isn't that like so honest? You know what I mean? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, uh, it's funny because then he actually, yeah, that guy did not look like your traditional hip hop star. He didn't have like abs or anything,
Yeah.
wasn't ripped. I forget the name of that artist, but that's like the only hit I remember he had. But boy, did it resonate with a lot of people, I think.
I think yeah, there's this weird I just saw this like random meme. I don't even know if it's a real quote or anything, but it was like a Bob Marley quote.
Uh-huh.
And it said like today people are being praised for being fake and punished for being real.
Wow.
So it's kind of this idea that if anybody steps out of line with what's socially expected with them, they get like in trouble. But if anybody's like, yeah, real and honest with how they feel, they get like
Right.
They get punished too. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But all right,
Yeah.
let's move on. This is my favorite one. This
All right.
next one. So I'm freaking excited to talk about it. My favorite form of masculinity is stoicism.
Ah,
Okay, because stoicism is like the ninja of masculinity to me.
tell me more.
Okay, so stoicism, okay, so stoicism goes all the way back to like ancient Greece, right? Like
Hmm.
literally Cato. I don't know if you know Cato. It's stoicism and like was it Marcus Aquinas or no Marcus Aurelius? He
Marcus
wrote the
Aurelius.
book, yeah, like wrote
Mhm.
the book Stoicism. So it's this idea that you like don't show your emotions, you like always stay calm and logical, that to let your emotions take over, you like lose credibility, so that it's this detachment that you will like, you always stay back. I almost think of like from Game of Thrones, like Tyrion Lannister, right?
Uh-huh.
Like he like even though he's like, short and has like there's disadvantages to him, he like always keeps his head, always has like a smart ass comment to make. That's
Right.
like, this stoicism idea. But here's the thing, is stoicism has like survived throughout the ages by evolving and changing. So today, the young men that like I work with or see, they would never be like, oh yeah, like I think it's just really important to never talk about your feelings.
Right.
They wouldn't say something like that. What they would say is like, hey man, or like, yeah, I like this is my friend, Mike, he's pretty chill.
Mm.
Right. So this idea of like being chill, like you don't cause any drama, you don't bring up any like problems, you're always just cool with everything. That's kind of how stoicism has shown up nowadays. But it essentially has the same idea. It's like don't complain, don't bring up any problems, don't bring up any feelings, and just go with whatever's happening.
Wow. Wow. Even though you might be, kind of struggling underneath, you know.
Hmm.
I think that's where the danger of stoicism, you know, becomes pretty apparent is when people start self-medicating and these other kind of things to avoid expressing their emotions to other people. Um, but at the same time, I see a lot of benefits to stoicism. Obviously, it's been around for a long time, right? So it's survived, and yes,
Hmm.
it's evolved, but it's survived. And I want to point out both men and women can be stoic, and when
Hmm.
both men and women are stoic to an extreme, they have the same problems. So there's something going on there. I'm trying to think of how. I mean, there's so much research to support. I'm not going to get into that too much, other than just say that there's a lot of prohibitions against men showing vulnerable emotions.
Hmm.
There as a guy, you can show one kind of emotion, and that's anger. You can
Hmm.
show that all you want, and there might be some repercussions to it, but generally it can be explained away. Like it's we punched a hole in the wall, but his dad just died, or something
Hmm.
like that. So you can kind of go like either extreme. You can either show no emotions, or you can completely fly off the handle and
Right.
show a ton of emotions, just as long as they're not sadness.
The other thing that I've found, Ryan, and I agree with that 100%. I think you're limited in the emotions you can show by stoicism. The other thing that I think is very real is like you're allowed like to show emotion, even like I think in real life. Like for example, if I went and saw like a sad movie and I cried, I think that would be like, except maybe if my like fiance or my girlfriend was sitting next to me, it would be very acceptable. And then like, oh, that's so sweet or that's so nice but
Mm.
I think once that it wasn't just a novel thing. Once like let's say like I always cried like throughout the like that was just a way I expressed my emotions, or I cried as much as a female like one of my female friends or a girlfriend or whatever. If
Yeah,
like once that becomes equivalent, then it gets old really really quick, and
right.
that person gets called crazy or unstable. So it's like you're allowed to show emotion a few times, but it's like you're running on borrowed time or something after that. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I think there's a couple different caveats to that. You ever heard of the term idiosyncratic credits,
Yes, I have.
right? From like social psych, right? So
Yes.
like if you have enough man points in one area, you're kind of allowed to then take some away in another area and sort of break the rules a bit. But if you don't have any man points in any area, it can kind of look bad on you. So yes, you sort of like make a withdrawal, if you will, from the Man Points Bank and cry
Mm-hmm.
during a movie. But if you're always withdrawing, you're going to eventually run out of man points. You would have to do something really,
Mm-hmm.
really big to have that be acceptable. But I also just point out that I don't think that would be normal for most people to cry every single time in every single movie. You know,
Mm-hmm.
where I think it gets dangerous is when we constrain men to not be able to express normal emotions at normal times.
Mm-hmm. Or let me give you another example. I think it's acceptable for guys to be depressed for a few weeks,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
right? And it's like, oh, he's having a hard time. But very quickly it'll turn into, all right, you better get your shit together.
You know, man up, get over it. By the way, man
Right.
up is the critical way that people experience the masculine threat.
Right.
Yeah.
And even that though, like I think that again speaks to that Ford. I'm gonna call it the Ford F-150 like
Yeah, yeah.
theory that I'm inventing right now, which is this idea that like if I were to literally go up to one of my friends and be like, "You better man up," in like a serious way, there I would be so douchey,
Right,
and so weird or whatever
right,
that it would be like, what the hell? So you'd almost have to say it like it would almost be something I would say ironically
right.
to my friend or something like that. That's what I mean is like there's like this way that it's sort of like if you and I were talking, I was like, what up, bro? Like I would be calling you bro. We both know that I would be joking
Yeah,
and that I was using it ironically.
yeah.
But you know what I mean? So it's almost like we're both acknowledging that this thing exists,
Right,
but
right.
but like kind of playing with it at the same time.
So, like, I get on the one hand, you're saying it's a stereotype that your typical like Barney character from How I Met Your Mother or the Ford F-150 guy. Those guys don't really exist. They're sort of uh, caricatures of this stereotype, right?
Hmm.
But the thing is that the stoicism thing that really does exist.
Hmm.
I've seen it with so many male clients. I'm sure
Right.
you've seen it too. I mean, it's some guys are dripping in it, um, and I think a lot of it is tied up into a form of avoidance. And so since it's sort of
Right.
socially acceptable for guys to do that, they become reinforced in those patterns and so on. But I see that a lot. Of course, I do want to also point out the Ford F1 5000 or whatever it is. That person also does exist too. When I was driving through Texas one time with my band, we got
Hmm.
passed by one of those gigantic like half-track trucks with a guy with a cowboy hat and a handlebar mustache, right?
Yeah.
5 minutes later, another one passed us, same cowboy hat, same mustache,
Right.
different color truck.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see that, and I would say that like I live in Texas, so so
Yeah, you do.
I also think that part of it is like it's almost beyond that thing. It's almost become like fashionable or a status symbol. At least where I live in Dallas. Dallas is this weird place where like you don't buy cowboy boots. You buy like $300 or $800 ostrich skin cowboy boots.
Oh yeah, Dallas is notorious for being very like high SES and
Hmm.
is that right?
But the same thing with like the F-150. Like you'd buy the King Ranch edition of the F-150, which is a real thing. The
That's
Texas
really called the
edition.
King Ranch.
It's called the King Ranch. There's also Texas editions of almost every truck that exists. But like again, it's not so much that you need it for the purposes of like being tough or anything like that. People buy it because it's a status symbol that
Uh,
you paid the extra. It's the same way of getting if you were to get a MacBook versus a MacBook Pro.
wow,
They're like, oh, you put the extra money in and bought like the premium edition,
wow.
right? So that's what I mean. Like the cowboy hat is no longer about keeping the sun out of your eyes. It's about like how much did you pay for your cowboy hat?
Yeah,
At least that's my read on it. Because
yeah,
within cowboy culture, there's like different names. So there's like the lowest form of a cowboy is what they would call a shit kicker,
yep.
and
That's
then
what I used
like
to
there's
call cowboy
like
boots.
right. And
Shit
then they would
kickers.
have they call if you wear like more like hipstery kind of cowboy clothes, they would call that like they call it like a drugstore cowboy.
Is there a rhinestone cowboy in there somewhere?
I'm sure there is, but it's kind of evolved into its own thing. It's not just purely about toughness. That's tied in and integrated. But
Right.
anyway, let's move on here though. That we're
Yep.
getting off. Once we start talking about Texas toughness, we're in a whole. That's its own field of study of masculinity right there that we could probably write a book on.
We probably
So,
should do a show on that sometime.
all right. So last one is what we call logic and expertise. This
Right.
one's a little trickier, I think. So Ryan, what's your take on this one?
Well, okay. So when I first got invested in the research in psychology and masculinity, like 2005, I read this book that was published in the 70s called The 49% Majority. I'm sorry, 49% Majority by Brannon
Mm-hmm.
and Junie. And what they did is they did a study, which I'd be really curious to see if this still happens today. This is in the 70s, all right, where they took every single like thing you could do, every skill. It didn't matter what it was, figure skater, like flower arranger, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
things that traditionally would be considered more feminine, right? And they just added the word expert in front of that. Then they also had one where they didn't have the word expert in it. And every single time, the word expert added about 2 to 3 percentage points on the man quotient, essentially, of how manly that skill was. So it was, you can be
Wow.
a flower arranger, but you can also be an expert flower arranger, and now suddenly you're a badass. So
That's really funny.
now it was a
So there's,
70s, so I don't know if it would replicate today. Yeah, go ahead.
well, I think it's just that it's like the idea that you refined a craft.
Right.
And I think that one goes all the way back to like hunting,
Oh,
right? It's like, it's this idea that you're like the best hunter. So
right,
you've developed this skill set, and so
right.
that's how I've always thought about that one.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, okay, because all like everything we've talked about today, people could argue is like evolutionary psychology kind of stuff.
Mhm.
That these are traits that were selected in men who are successful, and that's why, for mating purposes, we do these things. But the precarious manhood, I'm not sure where they stand on that whole issue, but I don't think they think it's biological. I think it's sociological.
Right. The other piece of this is like the logic one, and I think that that's
Mhm.
how maybe like hipsters or more millennial-esque slash zennial kind of people show this is like there's almost, and I think Reddit is like a really good sign, like good place to like see this, where people are kind of getting into these logic arguments where
Right.
it's like almost cool to call somebody out on like a straw man argument.
Mm,
Like where people, it's this idea that you can like out logic or outthink somebody else, and it shows up again as like it's not that different from like being physically stronger than somebody. That if you're more clever or you've like deduced or broken down their argument really effectively, then you're very masculine.
right.
I don't think you see women necessarily doing that to other women in the same way you see men doing that to other men.
So I have not seen this myself, but then again, maybe I haven't made like sort of. You're more on the ground, working with students. I'm not there as much, um, but I have seen just like I'm thinking like characters on TV and such that part of the way they showed their manliness, if you will, or definitely their skill and dominance was by being just wicked smart. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like really being really good at figuring things out. Um, like here's an example. You've ever seen the show Monk?
Yeah, you know what show I was going to reference was House.
Oh, House is a good one. Yeah, because he's kind of a traditional and masculine guy. Monk's kind of, a teddy bear. In many
Yeah,
ways. He doesn't really
but
have.
House is like showing by outsmarting anybody, he's allowed to break the rules, and
Yeah, yeah. And he's a mess, right? Like so he's
right.
also kind of showing and he's stoic. He's all these kind of things, right? He's kind of showing the consequences of adhering to these things too rigidly, if you will. But he
Hmm.
uses this masculine, just badass brain, essentially.
Right.
It's like a Vulcan or something, It's like they're completely devoid of emotion, um, but they're really good at just logic.
Hmm. And just being able to outsmart somebody else, because
Right.
it doesn't work like a guy like House sitting in a room being logical wouldn't be that impressive.
Yeah.
It's the fact that he can dominate somebody else or make them feel stupid
Right.
for like presenting the argument. That so the context of another is really important, I think. So
What about Sherlock Holmes too? I mean, that's a great example.
right, yeah, I would say that's a really really good example. Like maybe the classic example. Uh, yeah, that same kind of like you can solve the puzzle or something like that
Right.
too. I would say another version of that where it shows up is like Tony Stark, who's Iron Man,
Yep.
right? Like Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal that he's like a one step ahead of everybody. So,
Also a
okay,
mess.
also a mess. So,
Seriously,
anyway,
did you
so
notice a
these are
pattern here?
what's that?
There's like a pattern here, though, like where people who are winning at these things, most of the characters on television, maybe it's because of the multidimensional kind of way we portray masculinity nowadays. I don't know, but it seems like a lot of guys are kind of tortured.
Well, I would say it's different with with Robert Downey Jr. because again, he's like the CEO of a company
Right.
and like he kind of has it all. He's more like The Rock to me versus like House is like more of an addict who's falling apart,
Right.
in all ways.
I just watched Iron Man 2 last night, and he basically like self-destructs in
Oh,
that.
really?
Yeah. It's been a while since I remember that, but I forgot about like sort of the like he's drinking constantly. Well, he's drinking chlorophyll constantly, but he's acting drunk constantly. You know,
Right. But isn't that
just
like interesting? But isn't it interesting that I can't remember if is it Civil War or is it the newer the not Endgame but Infinity War
yeah.
where it starts off with him solving his own trauma. Like
Ah,
he makes the invention where he has like VR where he can go back and live his own trauma.
right,
Like
right.
that's got to be the most masculine mental health thing ever. You literally make an invention to do your own exposure therapy. So anyway,
That's
okay, so that is our five, one, two, three, four, five, six different examples. Now, which ones did we miss? Did we miss some? Are there other forms that show up? Let us know down in the comments below. We are now going to move on to the second part of our show, which is the research roundup.
research roundup.
Research roundup.
The first study is called Walking on Eggshells. It's a qualitative examination of men's experiences of intimate partner violence. So basically, this researcher, Elizabeth Bates, from the University of Cumbria in the United Kingdom, what she did is she interviewed male survivors of intimate partner violence. Majority of them were heterosexual, so these were women abusers that they were reporting on. And she just was looking for themes about those experiences. So three themes that really stick out to me, Kip: coercion, control, physical aggression, and psychological aggression. The reason they stick out to me is they're very similar to what we see when women report about the abuse they've experienced.
Right. And I think that's pretty interesting because when we think about men being like abused by women, I think what most people picture is like somebody being slapped in public or
Right.
something like that, but not necessarily like emotional, like the coercion thing. I think of clients I've worked with where somebody has been like made to feel excessively guilty for
Right.
like wanting to go out with friends or wanting to just go to work or like not coming home from work, and
Right.
so those are kind of the examples that I think of. How about you?
Exactly. I think of like almost like stereotype things I've seen in movies, you know.
Yeah.
And one thing I always noticed in those movies is that the audience members usually laugh. Like for instance, woman hits a man with a frying pan or something, and people laugh about it. But if it
Right.
were switched around, if it was a man hitting a woman, it wouldn't be that funny, of course. But I was
Right.
struck by the similarities and the this paper has a number of descriptions of what happened, and they sound very similar to not only my own clinical experience working with both men and women who have been in abusive relationships, but they sound really similar to like what women typically report in the research.
Right. So, kind of overall of the study is interviewed these men who were in abusive relationships. Those men reported very similar themes to what women experience in a abusive relationship.
Right.
Pretty interesting study. If you want to, I'll have it right below here. Go ahead and check it out. What do we got next, Ryan?
All right, so the next one is Adonis on the Apps, Online Objectification, Self-Esteem, and Sexual Minority Men. The lead author on this is Aaron Breslow at the Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology at, and this time is Columbia. But one of our old friends, Mike Parent, is on here from our division. So I thought it'd be kind of a cool thing to highlight the work he's doing. and them together. So what they did is they were looking at these dating apps like Grindr, Tinder, things like that, but they were looking at them in sexual minority men, and particularly trying to say, how does looking at these apps and using these apps influence the users' perspectives of themselves, in particular their self-esteem, their body image? They're using what's this theory called self-objectification theory, which basically just means the more I kind of sexualize myself, the more that leads to body dissatisfaction over time, because I kind of start surveilling my body and always being really careful to,
And I would say it's not just sexualizing yourself; it's literally objectifying yourself. So it's like I am as valuable as my 6-packs look good.
Oh, that's a good way. Yeah, that's a really good point.
So there's no longer the internal value to yourself; it's purely your body.
Right. Well, researchers have found support for this theory in a lot of different populations. This, as far as I can tell here, is the first one to look at it in this population with this kind of technology in terms of these apps. And what they found is that there was support for this theory, that the more you're using these apps, the more ultimately your self-esteem was decreased in terms of your body self-esteem. And that this was explained by kind of these theoretical processes that we would expect from self-objectification theory. But what's interesting, Kip, is that they didn't find that the amount that you used one particular app mattered. What really mattered was the fact that you were using multiple apps. So the more apps you use, the more likely this effect happened. That's kind of interesting.
So it's essentially like the more platforms that you're on, the more likely you are to objectify yourself, which can lead to things like body dysmorphia, eating disorders, all those kinds of things. Yeah, that's interesting that if you're just like on Grindr every single day, that wouldn't be as impactful. Maybe it's just if you're on Grindr and you're on, Hinge and you're on Tinder and you're on Bumble, you're like being objectified in so many different domains, I guess. Maybe that's what kind of does the trick. I'm not really sure. That'd be a great, I'd love to ask Mike why that kind of happens. So,
yeah, and I'd also be curious if it happens in heterosexual dating apps as well. In theory, it could, right? Because it's just any kind of objectification. But
I know there's a lot of research on like body image, eating disorders with like Facebook and Instagram that has pretty much come out with exactly what you would think is the more people are getting that as the kind of instant self-esteem boosts. From getting likes and everything, the more likely they are to become depressed, not like their body, feel like they have to maintaining this kind of like false image. So
right, that makes total sense. One of my students did a content analysis a long time ago of there was I think Out Proud or something like that magazine, or Pride magazine. I forget the name of it. It was a long time ago. But they found that the number of men who are like shirtless and just like basically these Adonises, as the title implies, they were everywhere, including my favorite one was this dentist. And it was just, the dentist was not wearing a shirt and he had like ripped abs. And he's like, come on down to so-and-so, I'll clean your teeth or whatever.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So there's also something going on in that particular culture.
Yeah, an over-objectification and sexualization for sure. So, all right, so that's the end of Research Roundup. Research Roundup. Yeehaw! I hope you enjoyed the episode. Shout out to the wonderful authors who put in a lot of work to get those studies done. Don't know if everybody understands the amount of work it takes to get a study done, but it's usually about 1 to 2 years worth of work to get something out there. So great job to everybody. That's the end of our show for today. My name is Dr. Kip Petrantonio, and with me,
Dr. Ryan McDermott.
All right. Peace out, everybody.
Audio Jungle.